Welcome, everybody, to Guardians 2024 conference. We have a great bunch of speakers today with invited talks for almost 2/3 of the day, and then a couple of technical talks towards the end of the day. We'll start with our tribute session for our 2024 Guardian, Mr. Peter Ash. And that will be presented by Dr. Julie Neidich from Washington University, St. Louis. So with that introduction, Julie, I'm going to make you a presenter.
Okay, the share has not popped up.
It should be there now.
There it goes,
There
it's starting.
Yeah.
All good.
All right.
I think what I'm going to do
If you click on the button to do screen share, hopefully we'll get your slides up. If not, I'll display them from my end.
Yeah, it's hard because I have 3 screens to decide which is the right screen. I know I think this is the right screen. All good.
There we go. Excellent. Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Brain Health Alliance is very excited to be honoring Peter Ash and Under the Same Sun for the work that he and his organization has been doing to guard the lives of children with albinism and others with albinism, not just children, around the world. This is Peter with a group of children in, I believe, Tanzania.
Yes, it is.
And this is a little bit about albinism and Peter and the work he does. People with albinism are not ghosts, but human beings. And that's from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And I think the key thing here is that people around the world, but specifically in African nations, have superstitions and taboos when it comes to children born with albinism. And there are amazing stories of these children, these individuals, these adults, and the supporters who assist them. And actually, it's Under the Same Sun that absolutely brought this to the forefront at the United Nations and the Human Rights Group. And it's key that it saves lives. So we honor and thank Mr. Ash as our 2024 Guardian in recognition of his devoted service to people with albinism in support of the health and well-being of these individuals who face discrimination and death in countries around the world. Hearing about atrocities committed against children with albinism in Tanzania, Mr. Ash founded Under the Same Sun. The work of this charitable organization helps save lives of these children with albinism. As a person with compassion for humanity, who cares for others, and who has albinism himself, Mr. Ash began his mission of helping children in Tanzania. His organization, Under the Same Sun, has created safe spaces to learn and given new life to these children. Mr. Ash has worked to bring the plight of those individuals with albinism to the United Nations and to other advocacy groups across Africa and around the world. His work has saved lives and provided hope, education, opportunities, and a brighter future for people with albinism. So, what do people with albinism face? Staring strangers. Well, lots of people with genetic disorders, and I'm not even called this a disorder because I don't think of albinism necessarily as a disorder, but staring strangers happens. But they face ostracism and bullying, rejection by their own families, a high risk of skin cancer, which means they actually need to have sunblocks, the risk of becoming victims of murder in countries where people believe a person with albinism is a ghost or bad luck. and there's a risk of being murdered for profiteering to sell their body parts. People with albinism have a genetic condition, and they have skin and hair without pigments like melanin, the biochemical that creates the variety of color tones we see across humanity. Albinism may be associated with a visual impairment as well, relating to the lack of pigmentation in the eyes. Most causes of albinism are genetic, and almost all of those are autosomal recessive in inheritance. I'm going to explain that with the next slide, but right now I'd like to say that the birth of a child with albinism should not target the mother, causing her to be rejected by the family, since both parents must be carriers of a pathogenic variant for a child to have a recessive disorder. There are other types of albinism. For example, there is an X-linked variety, but the numbers of patients are much smaller than the numbers who have autosomal recessive inheritance. Some people with forms of albinism have partial loss of pigment and have lighter colored hair, eyes, and skin than their family. Other pigmentary disorders, including vitiligo, are not strictly genetic, but may be caused by contributing factors related to immune system and the environment. So let's discuss autosomal recessive inheritance. If both partners are carriers of a pathogenic variant in the same disease gene, there is a 25% chance with each pregnancy of having an affected child with that disease. So here you have a carrier parent on one side and a carrier parent on the other side. They have no signs of the disorder and they don't know they're carriers until they have an affected child. And with each pregnancy, they have a 25% chance of having an unaffected child, a 50% chance of having carrier children who appear unaffected just like they do, and then a 25% chance of having an affected child. And this isn't just for albinism, this is for any autosomal recessive disorder. Males and females are equally likely to be carriers and equally likely to have the disease in an autosomal recessive disorder. And if both parents are carriers of variants in different disease genes, there's a very low risk to have a child affected with either disorder, although a child could be a carrier of one or both. So let's talk a little bit about Peter. Peter Ashe was born in Montreal, Canada, the youngest son of 3 siblings. One of his older brothers also has albinism. He obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in theology from Peace River Bible College and a Master of Arts degree in counseling from the Providence Theological Seminary. He worked as a pastor and as an entrepreneur and businessman. Along the way, he moved to Vancouver, married, and became a father. In 2008, he read about the killings of people with albinism in Tanzania. The compelling video evidence documented by newswoman Nikki Ntemi, I'm sorry, I probably butchered her name. I don't know if she has a click sound for the N or not.
Entitema.
I'm not sure. Peter, I'm sorry, say it again.
Vicky Entitema.
Entitema.
Yeah.
Very good. I've known other people who had an N at the beginning of their names and it was a sound.
Yeah.
But very good. I'm sorry. About the horrific trade of body parts from murdered people with albinism that sparked Mr. Ashe's activism. Within a year, he was in Tanzania advocating for people with albinism. His work spread across Africa and around the world. So here is a set of pictures of Peter with some of the folks in Africa who he's helped, predominantly in Tanzania, I believe, but all over. And it's not just Africa. We'll get to that soon. So what is vitiligo? People with vitiligo face the same ostracism and discrimination as people with albinism. It's where you have partial loss of pigment in the skin, and sometimes it's symmetric and sometimes it's not symmetric. Michaela de Prince was born in Sierra Leone in Africa and was put into a cruel orphanage as a toddler after her mother died. She was called a word that I'm not going to say that meant she was the least of the orphans due to her pigmentation. She was adopted by an American family, the De Princes, along with her best friend from the orphanage, who was the next to last of the orphans in her orphanage. She became a celebrated ballerina with the Boston Ballet, the Dance Theater of Harlem, and the Dutch National Ballet. And she died in September at age 29. It's very unfortunate because her career was just blossoming. So this is a photo of Michaela and a photograph of her doing a grand jeté, and it's perfect as far as her technique goes. That's just an aside. So the advocacy of Peter Ash and Under the Same Sun brought the plight of people with albinism, especially those in Africa, to the United Nations. Over the past 11 years, Under the Same Sun has brought together a global association of advocacy groups, including the United Nations. The African Albinism Network grew out of that association of advocacy groups. And note that albinism is not solely found in Africa, though there are more carriers for some types of albinism who are of African descent. Albinism can be found around the world. And this is a shot of the Global Alliance for Albinism in January 2020 in Paris, France. And you'll see Peter on the far right in the second row, but you can see that there are a whole variety of individuals here supporting the fight against discrimination against people with albinism. These are some of the links for advocacy groups for people with albinism. And you see we have highlighted Under the Same Sun, the African Albinism Network, the Global Albinism Alliance, the UN Champions of Albinism, and the urgent calls for protection. That happened just in June of this year when there were murders of a child with albinism in Tanzania. And there's a United States group on albinism and a UK group on albinism as well. And this is a list of references that I used in creating the slides, or we used. And these are contacts for Brain Health Alliance. And I thank you, Peter, for all of your work. And I'm going to stop sharing and give it to you, Peter, so that Carl's, I guess, going to
let me also salute you, Peter. Thank you so much for the incredible work that you've done to save lives. And I know that we're going to play the video from Under the Same Sun. So in order to do that, I'm going to stop our recording. I will then play the Under the Same Sun video, and then we will return, and I will resume the recording for any comments that you'd like to share, for any questions that we can discuss. So with that, give me a moment to get the video going.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, I think that's a great video that tells an important story with just the right tone, tenor, and style. So, Peter, you've just done a super job, and I want to open up this session to questions from anybody who'd like to turn on your mic and ask Peter questions.
Okay. Well, if I may, then you can hear me all right?
Yes.
Right. So, as Dr. Tazwell just said, this was a very well put together video, and it's great to see an organization like this where people with a medical condition can reach out can work together, reach out to the public, and help to get the word out about what the truth is about their condition. But then I'm also wondering what role you think the media has played in creating in the public image of people with albinism, because, well, I don't know what the media is like in Tanzania, honestly, but the in the U.S. Does seem like from time to time movie makers and others will sometimes use someone with albinism, an actor with albinism, to as a way of as a sort of visual shorthand for someone who's weird or doesn't belong, like the sniper in the Da Vinci Code, for example. And I'm wondering what your impression overall is, whether that's maybe just my own somewhat limited reference pool, or whether you think there's something you could that the some room for improvement there.
Thanks for the question. Good question. It's certainly something we've actually quite exhaustively documented. And thanks, by the way, for the opportunity to share with all of you today. Thank you for your kind attendance to this important issue. In response to your question, yes, people with albinism have become essentially, largely in Hollywood, a trope. They become kind of a shorthand for someone who is either weird or evil. Most often, we have documented, I think, about 30 cases of, even think of Moby Dick, classic novel. There's a whale in the book with albinism, and the whale is described as evil. Goes all the way back that far. So the concept in popular media often has been, because of the whiteness of our physical appearance, as you see with me, this concept of being odd or weird or ghost-like is certainly picked up upon. We see it in the Da Vinci Code. We see it in The Matrix Reloaded. I could, list one movie after another where people with albinism are either, at minimum, kind of ditzy and dumb and kind of silly. That's best case scenario. Or they're murderers or thieves. The funny thing about it, though, is that Hollywood doesn't even get it right when they depict someone with albinism for two reasons. They don't even use actors with albinism, number one. They take somebody who doesn't have albinism, put a white wig on them and a bunch of white makeup, and pretend that they have albinism. So they don't have the courtesy to come and ask actors with albinism to play the part. But the funny part about the Da Vinci Code is that people with albinism are visually impaired. The extent of that visual impairment varies, but the vast majority of people with albinism in Western cultures who have type 1 albinism, oculocutaneous albinism that I have, 95% of us are legally blind, which means we have 2200 vision, which means we don't have enough vision to drive a car. So what's the guy with albinism doing in the Da Vinci Code? He's driving a car, and while driving a car, he's shooting a weapon with great accuracy. So, again, completely impossible for somebody with albinism. So if you're going to use somebody with albinism, at least get it right. But of course, they didn't consult anybody with albinism when they made the portrayal. They didn't call us up and say, "Hey, by the way, what's the accurate portrayal?" So it comes out of lack of knowledge, comes out of ignorance. It has been a fairly negative portrayal for the most part. And so in the Western environment, the Hollywood and so on, that's what we've seen. And of course, as has been shared in the video and previously in the presentation, in African environments, it goes a step further to say that people with albinism are ghosts, they're evil spirits, they're not human, and they are bringing bad luck, or they have magical powers. In fact, in Tanzania and a number of African countries, it's believed that when people with albinism die, they don't die of natural causes. They actually vanish. They physically vanish into thin air, very much like if you're a Star Trek fan, you beam somebody up. That's kind of the idea that's believed. In fact, I remember years ago meeting a gentleman in Tanzania, in northwest part of the country, the Lake Zone, who was in his late 20s with albinism, and he actually deeply believed one day he was going to vanish. He shared with me his anxiety about getting up every morning, believing he would disappear, because that's what he was taught by his community, by his parents, by his teachers. So can you imagine the anxiety of waking up every morning, wondering, is this the day? Not that someone will kill me, but I'll somehow magically disappear, just vanish. And part of the reason for that belief is that people with albinism, when they die of natural causes, or other types of reasons for dying, the burials are almost always done secretly. So you'll hear people in the villages tell me, I've never been to a funeral of someone with albinism, so therefore they must vanish. Because funerals are a very public community event in most African cultures. The whole village comes out when someone passes away. People with albinism are often buried in secret, either because of shame or because they're afraid that the body parts will be harvested after death, because that's another type of violation that people with albinism experience in many African contexts, is that after death, they're not even safe in the grave. Their bones are harvested for rituals. So for a variety of reasons, they're often buried secretly. And so this contributes to this myth that people with albinism don't die a natural death, they just vanish, which again gives this sort of supernatural orientation that people have affixed to this condition. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks. That was very eye-opening.
It is, and I think I remember when I was young watching uh, a Star Trek where one person was black on one side and white on the other, and the other person was white on one side and black on the other, and they were having a major, like, they were killing each other off, and there were only two of their respective communities left because everybody had been killing each other because of the color of their skin, which I find just such an atrocity. I mean, how long ago did I see that, and how long will it stay with me that there's atrocities because of colors of people's skin? And we know that that's happened across America, not just for albinism, but also for people who have darker skin and have been persecuted here in the U.S. My question is a little bit different. And Peter, it takes a lot of bravery for a person who has albinism to go to a country where he might be reviled, or she or they might be reviled or attacked. So did you personally face violence as you started your program or in your journeys throughout all those African countries?
I'll tell you my story on that one. The very first time I went to Tanzania in 2008, my wife Debbie, I saw this video of Vicky Entertainment on the BBC website, the undercover footage she took of visiting this witch doctor and trying to negotiate the purchase of the body parts of someone with albinism, because she was trying to expose this trait. And so anyway, I watched the video and it grabbed my heart. I felt deeply moved and called to go and see if I could do something. Here's a Canadian guy, never been to Africa before, didn't know the culture, didn't know the language, but I knew that people with the condition I had, if they went to bed at night, would not go to sleep safely, wondering if someone would break through the door in the middle of the night and kill them. I thought, if I can do something, I got to do it, right? And so I would say to myself, okay, I've got to go there. And I told my wife this, and I was deeply engaged in the cause, and I was making my plans to go. And she said, now let me get this straight. You're going to a place where they kill people with albinism, right? I said, yep. And she said, you have albinism, right? Yep. She said, just so I'm clear on that. And she kind of paused. And I said, yeah, but she knows me. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a guy who, once you tell me it's hard, then I'm interested. And just like President Kennedy said when someone asked him, why do we go to the moon? He said, we do it because it's hard. And I did it because it was hard. And I am a man of faith, and I believe that I would have God's protection. I still believe that. The first trip I went, we did experience in Mwanza, which is a big city in the Lake Zone, the northwest part of the country. That part of the country is where a lot of the killings were happening. I remember us walking on the street and being called a variety of names by the public. One of the names was the Swahili term for money. So we saw it. I discovered fairly quickly my biggest threat was not really my albinism, because most people just thought I was a white guy from maybe Europe somewhere, like maybe I was Swedish or something. Because most people in Tanzania didn't believe I had albinism. They just thought you're just a Caucasian guy who's got particularly light hair. Because in their minds, albinism is somebody who appears to be African in terms of their facial features, but they're white. That's their typical understanding of albinism. But what I discovered fairly shortly is that my biggest threat was not the people, but with the government of Tanzania. On my very first trip, I actually remember getting on the plane, flying somewhere, and I ended up being seated next to the Minister of Home Affairs, who's in charge of the military. And he was very uncomfortable that he was seated next to me because he knew why I was in the country, because the media had widely covered my visit. And I had a very interesting chat with him. He was very uncomfortable. He was very sad that I was sitting next to him. And he accused me of staining the reputation of Tanzania in the international community. And he was very angry with me. And this guy controls the military and the police. And that day I went through the country, and the family I talked to you about in that video, Miriam's family, I visited her mom and visited her siblings. And the little girl had been killed just a matter of weeks before I arrived in Tanzania. And I actually saw the blood on the floor of her bedroom where she had been dismembered, and seen the photographs of the aftermath of her body. And I was quite angry. I got a call during that day that the Minister of Home Affairs wanted to meet with me and have a press conference. And I said, fine, I'll meet with him when it suits me. I have no particular allegiance to him after what he told me on the airplane. But we later on that day had a press conference at his behest. And I exposed the government of Tanzania, because what a lot of people didn't understand at the time was that the people who purchased the body parts of persons with albinism in African contexts, in Tanzania, for example, a complete set of parts of a body would be $75,000 or more. An arm could yield $3,000 to $4,000, or a hand. Now, in that context, when people's average income is $500 a year, that's a lot of money. And so you ask yourself, in a country like Tanzania, who has that kind of money to buy those body parts? The list is very short of people wealthy enough to do that. And it includes politicians and wealthy business people. It's common knowledge that many politicians visit witch doctors. And so I was exposing to the international community a dirty little secret that was going on in Tanzania for years. And I made it public through all kinds of media, the BBC, the New York Times, later on the United Nations. And the government of Tanzania was not happy. And so after that first trip, I came home unscathed, and I ended up taking security with me every time. Every time I go to Tanzania now, I have former British Special Forces guys with me, kind of undercover, following me around, because they told me that if I were to be attacked, it wouldn't be in broad daylight. It would be a mugging, or it would be a quote-unquote car accident. The government of Tanzania would like to silence me. And I've had some fairly angry interchanges over the years with some government officials. And so my biggest risk really was the government, more than it was actually people, because they can easily get a person who's more helpless in a rural community at night, who is a child, and get their body parts than get mine. But I was really exposing a trade, a very lucrative trade in human body parts, trafficking in human body parts. And so I became kind of the identified beacon for that. And so to this day, I still take precautions. I come home safely every time. There have been a couple of instances in the country where I was speaking at a conference. We hosted an international or a Pan-African albinism conference in Tanzania years ago in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And I was speaking there, and there was a man who tried to enter the conference building with a gun. Our security guys intercepted him. He claimed he was a journalist, but didn't have journalist credentials. And they dealt with him and ejected him from the building before he could enter. There was another case where I was supposed to speak at a meeting in a church, and I got really sick the day before and couldn't attend the meeting. And they found out 2 days later that the building that I was supposed to be in, at the front, there was a bomb that was rigged, that was later detonated by a cleaning lady who was in the church. And so it didn't go off as planned. It was an amateur kind of bomb. So those kind of little things that have happened, I've been safe every time, and our work has progressed and prospered, as you see. But yes, security has been a concern, but not one that stopped me from going.
Yeah. I think my second question has to do with the incidence of skin cancer amongst people with albinism and the need for sunblocks and other sun protection to try to stay out of the rays of the sun. I know that there's a new petition going around trying to get people to influence, I think it's the sub-Saharan African countries, to provide sunblock as a necessary treatment for people with albinism. Comments from you?
The petition you're referring to is actually, they're trying to lobby the World Health Organization to make sunscreen a necessary medicine, the category of a necessary medication, as it were. in African context, because it really is. That's the petition. Some African countries have done it, not many. We actually were involved in launching the first of its kind in Africa. In Tanzania, we years ago launched a sunscreen manufacturing plant that we partnered with a Spanish pharmacist at the time who was working in the country and had a mission to do this, and with a few simple ingredients made some fairly inexpensive, effective sunscreen. And that project operated for a number of years. Then it fell upon some difficulties because we found out one of the challenges of bringing sunscreen in from overseas is the shipping costs, the hassles, the importation. Really, the solution was manufactured in country. And secondly, the problem, even when you do that, in a country like Tanzania, it's extremely rural. There's a lot of remote rural communities, and a lot of people with albinism live in very difficult to access. It's not like big urban centers, where you can go to your pharmacy and buy for one thing, they don't have the money to buy it usually. But getting the sunscreen to the people is a challenge. So there were a lot of logistical challenges, even once we manufactured it, to get it into people. So what we really started doing was, in addition to sunscreen, we realized that the more effective and cheap way to do this was to encourage parents, to put long sleeves on their kids and to buy a hat. You can buy a hat for $5, a wide brimmed hat and a long sleeve shirt, and also to try and keep their kids out of the sun during the hottest part of the day. Try and get them working indoors or in the shade. And those are very inexpensive things. The problem with sunscreen is you need it forever, right? You use a bottle every month, and there's all these challenges. So we realized one thing we could do that would make a big difference was, like, of all the students in our education program, for example, they all wear uniforms at their schools. And most of the uniforms are all short sleeves, and the boys wear shorts and the girls wear skirts. And we said for our students that we sponsor in our education program, they all have to wear long sleeves and long pants. And so we had to go, and our kids didn't like it at first because then they looked different than the other kids because they were dressed differently, right? But we explained that, here's your options. You either dress differently or die of skin cancer, you pick. And we had to kind of be that blunt with them early on, because that is truly the prognosis of people with albinism in most of sub-Saharan Africa, is that the majority of them will die of skin cancer before age 40. So, which is completely preventable, right? So our goal is to prevent skin cancer rather than to treat it after the fact.
Could I ask a question?
Yes,
Carl?
of course, please.
So I'm interested to know, Peter, are there any cultures or countries that revere albinism, like in the Native American culture, two-spirited people, have a special place in the society? And I'm just curious if that's true in any cultures or.
Yeah, there is an Aboriginal group in Panama, in the San Blas region of Panama, that reveres persons with albinism. They have a belief that unless you have somebody with albinism in your ancestry, in your genes, unless you can demonstrate that, I guess, maybe up to your grandparents, I'm not sure how far it goes, but you have to be able to demonstrate that you either have albinism or have somebody in your family, immediate or extended family, that has it. You aren't eligible to become like a village elder or a chief. And that's very rare. That's the only instance we've heard of that. We still reject it. And the reason is that same magic that makes you good and right and powerful can be turned on its head in an instant. I'd rather people revere me than hate me, of course, but I'd rather they just treat me like a normal human being, actually. I don't want to be worshipped. I don't want to be, because it's still the supernatural connotation, right? That somehow there's something magical about you. And there frankly isn't anything magical about me. I just have a genetic condition that gives me a visual impairment and a difference in pigmentation. That's it. There's no difference between me and you otherwise. And so we just keep pounding on the fact that these are the only two differences: vision and skin. And once you get it down to that simple, it's amazing. What I will say in a positive way is that our education programs have been amazingly successful. When I went to Tanzania in early, like 2009, 2010, around that time, there was lots and lots of killings. I mean, we go through killings every month, just constantly. And we blanketed the country with public education efforts: TV, radio, newspaper. We actually had a couple of big campaigns that went into the rural areas, and we would target communities where the killings were happening. And we would bring our staff, who were highly educated, successful, healthy people with albinism, and others, in front of the community. And we'd educate village leaders, religious leaders, school teachers, medical personnel, and we would explain the truth about albinism and get rid of all these false beliefs. And what I will say positively is that it was amazing how quickly and easily the ignorance was dispelled. Most people said, "Wow, I didn't know this," and because one of the ideas is that people with albinism are stupid, they're not intelligent. Well, when you have a guy who's a bright guy who's speaking and conducting himself, and that's why all of our students with albinism who've gone through our program, many are educated and employed now with university degrees. So it's kind of hard to believe that people with albinism are a curse and they're not human when you go to school and your teacher has albinism or the guy who owns the business has albinism, right? And so we're trying to change the face of albinism in the country so that the stigma and discrimination is less possible. And that's beginning to happen in Tanzania in a fairly significant way.
And do you see that spreading to other African countries?
We do. Gradually, but slowly but surely. The African Albinism Network is an initiative we launched a few years ago to try and sort of replicate a lot of the stuff we had learned in Tanzania. We had figured out, we went to the School of Hard Knocks. I jokingly tell people when I started this organization, I went to the public library and looked on how to start an international human rights organization for people with albinism. I couldn't find a book. It didn't exist. There wasn't one on the planet doing what we were doing, literally, not exaggerating. And so we made a lot of mistakes, and we learned from our mistakes over the years, and we figured a system that works. And so we have created the AAN to basically try and replicate a lot of our knowledge. So we have the members of the AAN are albinism groups across Africa. So these are nonprofit, volunteer-driven support groups. And so we provide educational opportunities, conferences, we share information, teach them how to advocate, teach them how to fundraise, and so yes, we're seeing in many countries a reduction of the killings. In fact, at the African Union, through our efforts, we actually got the African Union to appoint an envoy for persons with albinism. And so we've raised the profile. When I worked at the UN quite a bit in Geneva, I would meet often with the African ambassadors and educate them and work with them. It was a very interesting little delicate dance we had to do in Geneva at the Human Rights Council at the UN because the Western countries didn't want to get behind the initiatives I was offering until the Africans got behind it. The Africans didn't want to get behind it until the Western countries got behind it because they wanted funding. And so there was this kind of circular game I had to play to convince both sides that this was a good thing. And so we eventually did through a lot of hard work. And so I would say that we made a lot of progress. Other African countries are moving forward, some more so than others. Kenya is a good example of one that's been particularly successful. They have $1 million US, I think it is, every year in their government budget for things like low vision devices, special glasses, binoculars, sunscreens, special products. And so the African Albinism Alliance, one thing it's doing is we have a model, what we call an NAP, National Action Plan. So we have a National Action Plan on albinism, where we lay out what government should do in healthcare, education, discrimination, public safety, inclusion, and we have a model and we present that and we get these albinism groups in their countries to try and lobby their respective governments to implement it. And a number of African countries now, I think about 8 if I'm not mistaken, the number always changes, have implemented such, and some are in various stages of implementation. So we're seeing, it's going to take a long time. It's a big challenge. There's a lot of countries. And our resources are extremely limited. This is a difficult cause to raise money for because it's very niche, it's very small. How many of you personally know somebody with albinism, have a good friend or family member with albinism? Probably very few of you. And so it's a rare condition in North America and Europe where the money comes from. It's not so rare in the African context, but that's one of the challenges we face is moving the work forward. As a lot of the small groups in these countries are struggling with funding, and sometimes when they get the funding, they don't manage it well because they haven't had training and expertise in how to manage funding, and there's issues of mismanagement and so on that we've had to deal with as well. So it's not an easy work we've bitten off here, but we're making progress.
Flip, did you have a question?
I do, and forgive my ignorance of this topic, Peter. But my guess is that even in the African context, the numbers with albinism are not large enough that one could, as a person of that condition, only interact with fellow persons with albinism. So how do you guys manage I don't want to use the word integration because I don't know that that's the right term, but the interaction with persons not having albinism? Because ultimately these children are probably going to have to know how to do that.
Yes, and actually, even like in Tanzania, the statistics show us about 1 in 4,000 people have albinism. And some numbers go as high as 1 in 1,500. So in Africa in general, the numbers are between 1 in 1,500 and 1 in 6,000, depending on the country, depending on the tribe, which is very high, because in Canada, the States, and Europe, it's about 1 in 18,000. And so one thing about Africa is albinism is a thing. Everyone has an opinion about albinism. Like, everyone knows it exists. You go to any place in Tanzania and you stand on the street randomly, and within an hour you'll see somebody walk by with albinism. Stand in the streets of New York. How many hours would it take before you saw somebody with albinism? And so it's a thing, and because it's a thing, we have to educate the public. And to your point, all of our students and all of our kids most of them have siblings with albinism. Their extended family doesn't have albinism. Their community doesn't have albinism. They might know somebody else in the village with albinism. And so one of the ways we try and model inclusion is in our education program. So we resisted the idea of creating quote unquote albino schools, which some people were trying to encourage us to do in the early years. And I strongly resisted that. And I said, that will just reinforce the segregation. It'll reinforce the idea that these kids are different. And so what we did was we used existing private English immersion schools that were already in the country that were successfully educating children without albinism. We also didn't want to put them in schools for disabled children, because again, it would reinforce the stigma. And we had to go into those schools and educate the staff, the teachers, about albinism. We do an Understanding Albinism seminar to teach them how to deal with these children. And we produced a booklet that they could use. And that act in and of itself created incredible outcomes. Because now you have, like, we put 50 kids with albinism in a school of, let's say, 300. So now, there's 50 kids with albinism all of a sudden show up overnight. Those kids are playing together at lunchtime. They're sitting together in class. And so the education and integration begins to happen. We have to do teaching on name calling and bullying and stigma and all of that. But over time, we've actually seen it to the point where our kids are often in the top 10% of academic performers, competing against students who don't have albinism. So our kids are some of the brightest academically in their schools. And that goes a long way to ending stigma, because then the reputation has been, man, these UTSS kids are really smart. And they're very motivated to succeed in education compared to most kids, because they know it's their only way out of poverty and stigma. If they don't get educated, they're going to be selling bananas on the side of the road and getting skin cancer, or working on the farm and dying of skin cancer. So they need to get a job that's largely a white-collar job that gets them indoors, out of the sun, maybe working in a business or a bank or a government office or a school or whatever it may be. And so the results of our program now, after having run it since 2010, 14 years, we have kids who've graduated with degrees who are in very prominent positions throughout society, right? And so now those kids have become ambassadors for change. And so UTSS has been their family, because most of these kids were rejected by their families. They're effectively orphans. The father almost always leaves when the kids are born with albinism because of stigma. So mom's left raising these kids with albinism. And so we are the ones who have acted as their parents. These are all boarding schools that we use. And so we're providing their shoes, their clothing, their medicine. When they need support, we're there. Our team is there. So, when I go to Tanzania, I just got back about a month ago. All the kids, because I've known these kids since 2010. So I've seen them grow up from little kids to university students. And right away, I walk into the room and they say, "Hey, Father, good to see you." They all call me Father. And the reason they do is because most of them don't have a father. They're almost always fatherless when you have albinism. And so we've noticed that these kids, when they're cared for and given love and affection and care, just like any child, and safety, they prosper. They succeed. So love is a very powerful thing, and
Yeah.
that's what we give all the time.
I've heard that, in fact, the rejection of the mother is sort of pervasive around Africa, but also Tanzania in specific, that when a woman has a child with albinism, it's almost automatically going to be that the father will reject her,
Yes.
as well as the child.
And actually, the father blames the mother for bringing this child into the world. And one of the things we do when we go into the villages is we do an educational component called Understanding Albinism. And we explain to the mom, who's almost always without her husband, who now she has a stigma. She doesn't have a husband. Financially, she's struggling. And she believes she has this sort of guilt that my other children now are struggling because my husband left me. I have no money. I can't eat. And so she feels horrible. This is somehow her fault. And we educate them that genetically, both parents have to carry the gene. And that it's funny when you tell them that fact, you can see the relief on their face. Like, oh, because all these years she believed she was responsible for all of the bad things that have happened to her family because this child with albinism was born, right?
Yeah.
So we destigmatize the mother and we try and create community supports. And I'll tell you a quick story. Just got back and saw a family. You had alluded earlier to the fact that there was a killing in Tanzania in May. So there was the mom was named Judith, and Asimwe was the name of the girl. And on May 31st, she was abducted from her home. And I went into the rural village where she was abducted just about a month ago. And it was difficult to get to. It was really, really far away. And we chartered a plane and to a really small dirt runway, and we drove a couple hours, and we got to the village. And I sat with Judith, and her daughter was abducted May 31st, in the middle of the night, taken away from the mother. She was gone for a couple weeks. They couldn't find her. June 17th, her body was discovered in a culvert, dismembered, as we expected. So the body parts could be used for witchcraft. And as I talked with the mom, Judith, she broke down several times. We had a bit of a memorial service with her, and we spent some time counseling her and encouraging her. And one of the things we noticed that was positive in her particular case is that when we showed up for this meeting with her, the whole community showed up. Like there was a good 25 people who were surrounding neighbors in this remote village that showed up. And unlike most of the cases, she had fairly good support in terms of even her father-in-law. And the father, by the way, most often is involved in these attacks. I should say that. Most often the father is involved in these attacks. They sell out their own children, either directly or indirectly. And so the father was in jail with 8 other men who were involved in this attack. And so we sat with Judith as she broke down. But even the father-in-law said, I don't know how my son could have done this. I don't know what was in his heart to do something like this. But even he was supportive of Judith as we sat with her. So, there's a bit of a shift happening in the culture where there's a higher degree of awareness. When I went there 15 years ago, nobody really understood albinism at all. Like stigma and also we're noticing in some of the rural communities, some fathers are now involved with their children. We're actually seeing examples. There's a pastor I know who does outreach into some remote villages, and he told me about 4 years ago that one of the things he's seen change since our work began is that often he'll see fathers sitting with their children with albinism in the community, which you would never see 15 years ago. And so we believe our public education efforts and creating all these educated kids with albinism is shifting the way people think about albinism in the country. So we have a method that we prove works. We know how to tackle this problem. We know how to change people's hearts and minds. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of sacrifice, it takes a lot of time, but it can be done.
I think the last thing that I wanted to mention is that the numbers of murders of children with albinism rise right around the elections. And you alluded to that before, but it really is the politicians who are fueling these murders.
Yeah, they're certainly involved in it. Like, and the problem with you're appealing to governments to get involved in stopping this, right? But the very people you're appealing to, some of them are the problem, right? So that's the problem you have, which is why a few years into our work, I shifted my focus from governments to grassroots work. I pretty much gave up on the government doing anything significant after a few years. And we focused most of our efforts on the grassroots communities in the villages, changing the way people think. Because my idea is this: if you change the way people think about albinism, and then somebody comes to you and says, I'll sell you a body part of someone with albinism so you can become rich and powerful, and I'll use it in witchcraft. And then if you say, well, that's ridiculous because this person's just a normal person like me, why would I buy this body part? Then you get rid of the demand, right? So how do you get rid of this killings? You get rid of the demand, right? And that's the long, arduous process of education. And so to your point, there's some very good people in government, don't get me wrong. We've met some good ones over the years that have been behind us and been with us. And increasingly, there's pressure. One thing I should mention before I finish my talk is that when I was in Tanzania a month ago, some of you may not be aware of this. I don't know how many of you have heard of the African Court of Human and People's Rights. So it's very much like the International Criminal Court that meets in The Hague, except it's an African version of that. And it's based on human rights issues. And we about 5 years ago applied to have a case heard by the African Court. And it incidentally happens to be hosted in Tanzania, just by pure coincidence. And it's a panel of 9 judges that we had a case. Our case came to fruition in September. We had a number of our students testify. And basically, the way the African court works is if your country does not give you remedies for access to healthcare, education, safety, security, human rights, and you can demonstrate your own country has not given you, you can bring your case to the African court. So people with albinism, represented by us and other groups, brought our case, and we had a 2-day hearing in Arusha, Tanzania, of a panel of 9 African judges around this matter. And we won't get the results of the hearing till November, December, January. But we asked for several things. If we're successful in this court process, which we think is very likely we'll win, then what will happen is the government of Tanzania will be mandated by the African court to do certain things. And that will then be a model for other African countries who want to take their respective governments to court. So we're making progress on many different levels, which we're very encouraged by.
Peter, we only have a few minutes if we're going to stay on schedule, but I did want to ask the question relative to the comment about, circular game, local, regional, global, within Tanzania, within Africa, the entire Western world, with any clarification with respect to the actual trade in body parts. Is the trade in body parts local within Tanzania? Does it go across Africa? Does it go around the world? To what extent do you address from local, regional, or global perspectives to break that circular game of everybody, passing the buck to someone else?
It was funny, years ago when the killings decreased in Tanzania, probably around 2015, 2017, they were going down. Everyone was, and the government, of course, was taking all the credit that they had gone down, and they were all celebrating the fact that the problem was resolved, nothing going on. What we found out was there was several countries that geographically bordered Tanzania, that at exactly the same time when the killings decreased in Tanzania, they went up in Burundi, Kenya, Uganda, which geographically border them. So what we believe was happening was that they were sending, the killers, the hired hitmen, as it were coming from other countries. And so some of the killings went up in those countries. So it could have been Tanzanians going to those countries. It could have been people from those countries coming to do the killings. So when it would go down in Tanzania, it would kind of go up in other neighboring countries. And so the pattern made us suspicious. We do know we have some evidence of cross-border trade in Africa of body parts. There was a man in DRC, a businessman, who was caught leaving Tanzania with body parts years ago in his luggage. The problem is that the borders are porous, and there's a lot of land borders, and they're not well policed. And Interpol is not all that active in that area in sub-Saharan Africa. Law enforcement resources are scant in most countries to begin with. There is no 911 in any of these communities that I go to. It just doesn't exist. You can wait a day for the police to show up. So yes, we know what's going on. We have bits and pieces of information, but it's not well documented simply because of all the challenges I just mentioned. So we have not heard of cases where they've been exported beyond sub-Saharan Africa so far.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Again, we salute you as our 2024 guardian of truth and integrity, saving lives. And with that, I'm going to temporarily pause our recording, give everybody a 2-3 minute break, and we will resume in less than 5 minutes. So please take a 2-3 minute break, everybody. Thank you.